The nightmare begins. A chilling discovery in Bear Valley. Bear Valley had always been a haven for those seeking solitude, adventure, or a breath of crisp Colorado mountain air. Sprawled out beneath the wide-open western sky, the rolling slopes and dense pine forests seemed to promise nothing but serenity. Locals from Mountain View often spoke of Bear Valley as a quiet escape, where hikers, birdwatchers, and hunters lost themselves in the wild, and the only real danger was the occasional black bear foraging for berries. That false sense of security shattered one muggy afternoon in late August 1993. It started with Jeremy Clark, a 30-something logger with calloused hands and a reputation for minding his own business. He'd spent most of the sweltering day operating the old saws at Oak Ridge Timber, his flannel shirt soaked in sweat by the time he loaded up his pickup and made the bumpy drive up to the hills. Jeremy needed a particular kind of wood, a knot-free maple, for a rush job his boss had demanded. The Upper Creek banks of Bear Valley were known for just that. It was risky, but Jeremy figured he'd be in and out before dusk. Taking a circuitous trail off the main path, Jeremy hacked his way through poison ivy and low, stubborn shrubs. The deeper he crept into the thicket, the quieter the world became, his footfalls muffled by damp moss and fallen pine needles. The only signs of life were the occasional scatter of deer print and the haunting call of a jay overhead. Then, somewhere near a dry creek bed, littered with driftwood and trash washed up during the spring thaw, Jeremy caught a whiff of death. Not the usual musk of animal decay. This was sharper, more metallic, unmistakably human. Anxiety flicked up his spine. He pushed through a tangle of brush, boots squelching in the mud of the shallow ravine. There, half buried among the rocks and rotting branches, lay the remains. At first, Jeremy thought it was a mannequin. Pale limbs twisted at unnatural angles, clothes shredded and faded. But the smell was real. And so were the flies, and the way the August heat seemed to press a leaden hand on the scene. Panic warred with disbelief as Jeremy scrambled back, nearly losing his footing, until years of hunting accidents and backcountry experience took over. He steadied his breath, wiped his brow, and pulled the radio from his jacket. "Dispatch, this is Clark from Oak Ridge Timber. I'm in Bear Valley, about half a mile from the old logging road. I need Mountain View PD, hell, and probably the coroner. We've got a body here. Looks bad. Real bad." Within 30 minutes, Bear Valley echoed not with birdsong, but with the wail of sirens. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees. Sheriff Sam Collins, flanked by deputies and suited detectives, ducked the police tape fluttering in the mountain wind. Flashlights gleamed over the macabre sight. The victim was a young woman, her body badly decomposed, naked save for a tangle of fabric around her chest. Her lifeless arms were bound tightly at the wrists by what looked like a military-style belt. The position, face down, head twisted toward the line of distant pines, spoke of violence, performed in haste, and cruelty. The scene dampened all idle chatter as curiosity seekers gathered at the perimeter. Only the professionals moved close, marking evidence with neon tags while the coroner's team whispered about significant trauma and the advanced state of decay. Bear Valley was supposed to keep secrets buried in its soil, but now the earth was giving them up to the world. News traveled fast in Mountain View. Before nightfall, rumors seeped through every diner, bar, and church in town. There's been a murder in Bear Valley. The stories grew wilder with each telling, but nothing could rival the horror that law enforcement confronted that day. No one knew her name. No one came forward to claim her. But everyone knew, from that moment on, Bear Valley would never be the same. For Jeremy, the discovery was a wound that wouldn't close. He replayed the moment over and over, the sickly sweet stench, the flapping of crows, the way the shadows had seemed alive and menacing. For the residents of Mountain View, the nightmare had only just begun. The familiar forests were now tainted, haunted by a darkness more fearsome than any wild animal. That first gruesome discovery would soon spiral into something much, much worse. But on that day, with the sun sinking behind the jagged peaks, none could imagine the depths of evil and despair about to unfold in their once peaceful valley. 3 bodies within 200 yards. The haunted grip of fear. The finding of a single body was enough to rattle Mountain View to its core, but the nightmare was only beginning. By the time Sheriff Sam Collins finished giving orders at the scene, dusk had fallen thick and fast, painting Bear Valley's slopes in a shroud of looming shadows. The air was damp, and a hush had settled among even the most seasoned first responders. Something about the ravine felt laden with an evil that seeped from the very earth. Just as the forensic team began their painstaking cataloging of evidence, Deputy Monica Ramirez, her boots slick with mud, paused near a bend in the dried creek. Her flashlight, cutting sharply into the tangle of brush, illuminated something that made her blood run cold. Another patch of torn-up earth, a smear of dark stains crusted along the rocks, and what looked like a pale, bone-thin hand curled around a root. "Sheriff, you'd better come quick," she called, her voice barely steady. Collins and 2 detectives hurried over, their bootsteps crunching over sticks and leaves. In a matter of moments, it became horrifyingly clear. A second woman's corpse was tangled in the weeds, flesh having sloughed away, until most of what remained was yellowed bone and muddy rags. Like the first, she had been bound. Her torso was naked, and a faded camisole drooped loosely around her waist. The body's position, sprawled under a thicket of poison oak, suggested a struggle, a desperate, losing fight. The valley seemed to squeeze in on itself. Each time an officer stepped, every heartbeat thudded with the possibility of more. The technicals worked in silence, photographs flashing, yellow markers mushrooming around the newest grim discovery. The search swept wider. Officers fanned out, now working full adrenaline, unspooling crime scene tape as the sheriff radioed for more backup. Then, barely 100 yards farther up the ravine, Detective Clyde Anderson tripped in the gathering gloom over what he thought was a mossy tree root, only to find a third form, partially submerged in the shallow puddle of an old rain basin. This last body had, in the cool shade, decayed catastrophically. The face was nearly lost to decomposition, while the hands, bound tightly with what looked like a strip torn from an army surplus belt, stuck straight out in a grotesque tableau. The waterlogged ground had preserved parts of the corpse in an unnatural, waxy state. The term wet corpse was muttered with a shudder among the forensics team. The naked torso told the same story as the others, stripped, brutalized, tossed aside like refuse. By the time the floodlights were set up and the valley blazed unnaturally under their harsh glow, news had reached the Mountain View precinct. 3 female victims, all discovered in under 2 hours, all in various stages of decomposition and humiliation, all within a stone's throw of one another. For veteran officers, it was an atrocity of almost mythic proportions, serial murder not just hinted at, but laid grotesquely bare. A sickened dread crept into the spaces between the working officers. Every scrape of a shovel, every flicker of a flashlight, felt like a descent deeper into hell. Deputies swore as they worked, nausea prickling at their throats. The coroner, a man hardened by years of tragic accidents on icy highways, quietly excused himself to retch behind a pine. Word spread swiftly as local news crews clamored for a closer look, and the sheriff's department struggled to maintain the perimeter. Families clustered in their homes, eyes wide as TV anchors reported multiple murder victims discovered in Bear Valley. The phrase serial killer slipped like poison into Mountain View's conversations, an unthinkable terror now starkly real. Sheriff Collins stood apart for a moment beside his SUV, surveying the lit-up macabre crime scene. 3 women, none of them identified yet, each suffered a final terror alone in the quiet wilds, their bodies hidden, but not carefully enough. And whoever did this, he realized, had stalked these woods either in plain sight or under the cloak of night. A local, perhaps, or someone who knew Bear Valley the way a predator would its hunting ground. The next hours were a blur. Body bags zipped, forensics, teams collecting soil samples, canine units arriving to sweep the rest of the area, and volunteers from the state police ferrying equipment up muddy slopes. The woods that once cradled childhood memories and campfire songs now pulsed with the urgency of a manhunt. For the officers who witnessed those 3 victims in the space of just 200 yards, the night left a permanent scar. Collective suspicion fell on everyone who called Mountain View home. Whispers of danger and evil clustered at every door. Mothers pulled their daughters off hiking trails. Teachers warned students never to venture into Bear Valley alone. This wasn't rural Colorado as anyone had ever known it before. And as the truth of this horror set in, one thing became clear. The nightmare was far from over. The Bear Valley killings would not only haunt the mountain, but ripple into every corner of the community, an unspoken threat that would linger for years to come. The first pieces of the puzzle. Who were the victims? The grisly discovery of 3 bodies in Bear Valley turned not only the valley, but the whole of Mountain View into a slow-burning panic. Yet for the Mountain View Police and Sheriff Collins' exhausted team, the next and equally daunting question was one that cut deep. Who were these women? Each victim, found within such a short, terrifying distance, had lost not only their lives, but their voices, their stories. As the floodlights flickered and camera shutters flashed, an uneasy silence thickened over the site. Forensics, bundled in white Tyvek suits and blue gloves, worked into the night cataloging every shred of evidence, knowing it might offer the only clue to the women's real identities. The condition of the remains was a challenge unto itself. Animal scavengers, rain, and the relentless Colorado sun had each exacted their toll. The first body, discovered by Jeremy Clark, was badly decomposed, skin sloughed away, dirty hair clinging to a skull contorted in a silent scream. The second was mostly bone, with scraps of faded clothing tangled in the undergrowth. The third, preserved in that shallow, muddy pool, had a curiously waxy texture, the so-called wet corpse, that both aided and hindered the coroner's examination. Detective Monica Ramirez, newly promoted and eager to prove her mettle, spent hours at the valley site, bent over each corpse with reluctant reverence. Each woman bore similar signs, wrists bound with what looked like surplus military belts or makeshift restraints, deep ligature marks circling their throats. Some bore defensive wounds. One victim's knuckles were shattered, likely broken in a last, desperate fight. Yet clothing was scarce. The only consistent article was a tattered camisole and a single white sock at the feet of the third body. Every item, no matter how trivial, was zipped into an evidence bag and catalogued. Broken jewelry, dark strands of hair clinging to bark, a faded plastic barrette, even cigarette butts crushed in the mud nearby. A volunteer combed through the grass and retrieved half of a torn, rain-smudged photo. It showed a blurry young woman, maybe one of the victims, maybe not, smiling beside an unfamiliar river. In the forensic lab, pathologist Dr. Irene McAllister pored over dental records and fingerprints. Most of the remains offered little. Months of exposure had erased much. But on the first body, McAllister noted a small metallic glint embedded in the jaw. After careful extraction, she realized it was a dental filling, a rare old-fashioned amalgam, the kind preferred by a single run-down dentist over in Boulder. That slim lead, passed on to Sheriff Collins, marked the first faint hope. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Lieutenant Grady Wallace turned his small office into a war room. Dozens of missing persons files, photographs, and notes plastered the corkboard. The months prior, as usual in small towns surrounding a big city, saw their share of young women gone missing. Waitresses, students, even a drifter or two, all written off as runaways or lost to Denver's streets. Names like Jenny Hart, Lisa Mays, and Cassandra Lynn drifted through the radio chatter. Sergeant Wallace and his team began the agonizing process of contacting local families, shelters, and campus police. Calls went out to the nearby reservations, bus depots, truck stops, and even local bars. The task was grim and methodical. Is this your daughter? Have you seen her since early summer? Breakthroughs came agonizingly slow. On the bank near the wet corpse, investigators discovered a cheap imitation leather purse, ripped, soaked, but miraculously preserving a faded driver's license. The name, Amanda Torres, age 22, listed address, Greeley, Colorado. Ramirez hurried to run the ID, no immediate next of kin. But Amanda had been reported missing by her older sister 6 weeks ago. Forensic analysis of a single silver earring, greatly tarnished but distinct in its southwest pattern, provided a match to a recent missing person report. Sherry McLennan, 21, once a clerk at a Mountain View convenience store, last seen leaving a party off Route 28. The same earring had been described in painful detail by Sherry's mother during a TV plea for her return. The third victim proved the hardest. No match on dental or fingerprints, no wallet, no jewelry besides a broken chain. Several battered facial bones were reconstructed with the help of a local forensic artist and a state-of-the-art computer. A rough portrait emerged, her features broadcast alongside the others across every Denver news station and morning paper. Meanwhile, detectives compared notes on the physical evidence. The killer, whoever he or she was, seemed to follow a pattern. Targeting women in their early 20s, all with short dark hair and similar body types, and all attacked with the same brutal methods. Nearly each wrist bore the same telltale chafing and military-style knot. Most chillingly, the area of Bear Valley where the bodies were hidden was a wild, twisting maze of animal trails, impossible for outsiders, but familiar to locals. Someone had chosen those burial sites with care. As the news broke, calls of both sympathy and fear poured in, from family members, from ex-boyfriends and former co-workers, from reporters and amateur sleuths. Sheriff Collins met with the McLennan and Torres families in the cramped, fluorescent-lit lobby. From that moment, the women lost in Bear Valley took on names, histories, and loved ones desperate for answers. But despite these first clues, more questions festered in the small town's air. Who was the third woman? Was there a pattern? Or was it random evil? Was the killer working alone? Or with help? And how had he stalked his prey so easily under everyone's noses? Those initial findings, marked by 3 crucified lives and a handful of rain-soaked clues, galvanized the investigation. Somewhere in the mosaic of broken jewelry, battered bones, and missing persons reports, the truth waited to be unearthed. And as the team locked in for the long, grueling hunt, Mountain View braced for still more revelations that maybe, just maybe, Bear Valley's nightmare was only beginning. The search for a living witness, a miracle escape. In the days following the Bear Valley discovery, the investigation quickly turned into a frenzied manhunt. Yet early on, a single question tormented the detectives more than any other. Was there anyone who had survived this monster? Rumors began as whispers in the Mountain View diner. Sheriff Collins started receiving anonymous calls to the tip line, some frantic, others cryptic. One call, however, jolted every deputy awake. An ER nurse at St. Agnes Hospital reported treating a battered, semi-conscious young woman weeks earlier, found naked and bleeding near a remote logging road not far from the killing ground. The incident had been logged as possible assault, possible exposure. The patient had vanished before social services could intervene. Detective Monica Ramirez and Deputy Anderson dropped everything and drove straight to St. Agnes, the hum of worry vibrating between them like an open wire. There they poured through digital archives. One entry stood out. A Jane Doe admitted July 10th, suffering blunt force head trauma, hypothermia, and marks around the wrists and neck matching classic restraint injuries. She'd arrived in a blank daze, unable or unwilling to answer basic questions. Within 48 hours, she checked herself out, leaving a fake name and an unsigned discharge form. While the hospital could provide no forwarding address, the doctors remembered her. A petite woman, probably mid to late 20s, hair hacked unevenly short, with haunted feral eyes. Against their advice, she'd limped out onto Main Street and melted away into the mountain fog. Mountain View PD put out a statewide alert with the hospital sketch. Days later, a social worker in the small town of Pine Bluffs, 100 miles east, called to say she'd seen the woman, huddled behind a gas station, searching in dumpsters for food, refusing to answer to any name but Ali. Deputies rushed there, canvassing shelters, motels, and soup kitchens with the hospital sketch in hand. Most folks shrugged, but one innkeeper recalled a woman fitting the description checking in, paying cash, shaking, and refusing to let anyone see her face. Finally, after relentless questioning, a motel manager phoned in that the woman called Ali had just checked in for the night. Detective Ramirez, heart pounding, arrived with 2 deputies. They knocked gently, announced themselves, and waited with bated breath. From behind the battered motel door, they heard the shuffle of slippered feet. The door opened a crack, chain still attached, revealing a narrow sliver of face, sunken eyes, bruised jaw, hair stiff and uneven. Monica spoke softly. "Ali, we're with the police. We want to help. We know what happened in Bear Valley. We need your help to catch the man who did this." There was a long, trembling pause. The woman's eyes flickered with fear, then cautious hope. She let them in. Inside the room, Ali, soon identified as Alicia Porter, 28, reported missing from Boulder, sat on the bed, clutching a threadbare blanket. The scent of antiseptic still clung to her hair. Surrounded by officers and with kind guidance, Alicia haltingly recounted the incident that had nearly cost her life. She'd traveled to Mountain View looking for odd jobs, desperate for cash. While drinking coffee at a highway rest stop, she was approached by a man in his 40s, short, wiry, a square jaw, and an unnerving, toothy smile. He promised work-clearing brush near the valley. Alicia hesitated, but poverty won out over distrust. She followed him to a battered gray pickup. He drove deeper into Bear Valley than he let on, taking back roads Alicia had never seen. He made small talk, friendly, almost too friendly, about hunting, about the woods, about local girls who disappeared. Half a mile from the main road, he pulled over and beckoned her to follow. That's when she saw the rope in his hand. Alicia, suddenly wary, tried to turn back, but he struck her hard across the head with a metal pipe. She went down in the brambles, dazed, ears ringing. Distantly, she felt her wrists being dragged behind her and tied tight, those same military knots that the police had seen before. He whispered threats in her ear, his breath thick with the reek of cigarettes and whiskey. He tried to drag her off the trail, but Alicia's survival instinct surged. She bit his hand, kicked wildly, and rolled into a ditch. As he lost his grip for a split second, she bolted, racing through thorn bushes, branches cutting her arms and legs, mind swirling with fear and adrenaline. Somehow, Alicia managed to outrun him, hiding beneath deadfall and brush as he searched, furious, only yards away. She spent the night shivering, delirious, barely conscious. At dawn, crawling toward the distant sound of a logging truck, she finally collapsed in a rut by the roadside, where local woodsmen found her and summoned help. As she told her harrowing story, officers scribbled notes feverishly. Alicia described his voice, raspy, Cajun maybe, but sometimes soft. His truck, old dented tailgate, camo seat covers, his faded blue work shirt buttoned to the wrist, details that matched the emerging psychological profile of the Bear Valley killer. She remembered nothing after crawling away, her recovery a blur of pain, fear, and hospitals, until that moment in the motel, months later, when the dread finally began to lift from her chest. Her testimony brought the first rays of hope to a battered investigation, a living, breathing survivor who could recall the killer's face, voice, and habits. Sketches were updated, roadblocks set, police began scouring back roads for the gray pickup. For the first time, it seemed, Mountain View's lawmen weren't just cataloging tragedy, they had an edge. Alicia Porter's miraculous escape put a crack in the killer's plan. From that day, investigators knew they were dealing not just with a ghost, but a man with a name, a truck, a scent. Finally, something that could be hunted in return. The case files grow, twisted clues and strange leads. If the discovery of 3 bodies felt like a waking nightmare, the days that followed revealed the investigation to be more of a puzzle from hell. With every lead the Mountain View police chased, new layers of complexity and confusion unfurled, turning Bear Valley's case files into a sprawling, tangled web. The deeper the investigators dug, the more it seemed like the killer, or killers, were taunting them, leaving disconnected traces and making sure nothing tied together easily. Detective Monica Ramirez sat at her desk, surrounded by piles of evidence bags. She flipped through crime scene photographs under harsh fluorescent lights, while rain lashed the precinct windows, a relentless, drumming counterpoint to the clatter of typewriters and police radios. The air smelled of burnt coffee and tired hope. On her wall, 3 maps of Bear Valley, needles bristling with colored thread, each color corresponding to a body, a sighting, or a potential connection. It was at this point, as Rocky Mountain Fall began to strip the trees of color, that the weirdness multiplied. Within days of Alicia Porter's escape and the public identification of 2 of the 3 original victims, rumors started swirling. Truck drivers called to report picking up hitchhiking girls who then vanished. Campers told stories of seeing shadowy figures lurking near abandoned ranger cabins. A trapper, out checking his snares, found a women's sneaker wedged into a split rock miles from the primary scene. One of the most promising leads appeared almost by accident. Officer Julie Benton, assisting in a door-to-door canvass of the town's fringes, stumbled across a motel ledger from April. The register listed a young woman, Jenny Tran, 21, with Asian features, who'd paid cash for 2 nights with a companion identifying himself as Luke Freeman. The note in the remarks column read only, "No disturbances." Quiet. Curiously, none of the regular desk clerks remembered either guest. Security footage was overwritten days later. The room had been stripped clean, not even a stray hair could be recovered. Yet Benton's curiosity led to checks of more motels along the state road, and each came up eerily similar. Cash, nondescript aliases, no trace after checkout, always at the edge of the valley. Nearby, at the Oak Ridge Timber Processing Shed, an old-timer named Pete gave police another riddle. He clearly remembered seeing a beaten-up gray Chevy pickup parked along a back trail multiple times that summer. Pete claimed he once caught a glimpse of a tall, thin man inside the cab, hat pulled low, who never came into the yard for supplies, just watched. Every time the Chevy vanished, so did a handful of young women rumored to be squatting near the sawmill's abandoned bunkhouses. The police scoured surrounding forest, uncovering makeshift campsites. In one, covered only by a blue tarp, they discovered the remains of a campfire, several cigarette stubs, empty malt liquor cans, a torn page from a local phone book, and, most chilling, a military-style belt with the initials VL stamped into the leather near the worn metal buckle. The belt was bagged and sent to the lab. It would become both a recurring motif and a source of endless dead ends. Meanwhile, back at headquarters, the task force bore down on the mounting paperwork. Dozens of missing person reports had to be reconciled with the timeline of the Bear Valley murders. 2 runaway teens from a group home in Boulder, an estranged daughter last seen at a truck stop outside Fort Collins, a cocktail waitress who left behind an apartment full of unpaid bills. Many of the names overlapped on the maps, but the deeper they searched, the more cases proved unrelated. A spine-tingling reminder of just how many lost girls haunted the highways of Colorado. A break of sorts came when investigators found a battered imitation leather purse in the brush near a secondary mountain trail, less than a mile from where the third victim had been pulled from the marsh. Inside the purse was a crumpled, water-stained wallet with a photocopied driver's license for Amanda Nguyen, age 22, and 2 torn motel receipts with the name Freeman L. Amanda had officially been missing for 37 days. Her last contact a call for a ride at 2 a.m. from a borrowed payphone. Investigating Amanda's last movements led detectives down a string of dead-end false alarms, but also provided a pattern. Every woman seemed to be last seen near remote rest stops, bars, or job postings promising easy cash. On the outskirts of town, officers interviewed weekly laborers at the Bear Valley gas station. Several recalled, with varying degrees of clarity, a wiry white man with a patchy beard who cruised the lot in the evenings, sometimes handing flyers for brush clearing, easy painting, or moving jobs. One local waitress even remembered a conversation with a jittery young woman with dark, chopped hair and a mismatched jacket who was nervously eyeing the clock and studying the help-wanted board just hours before she disappeared. Other clues teased and confounded the case. A half-burned notebook found at a deserted fire watch tower contained a list of first names: Casey, Lila, Juniper, Amanda, and cryptic phrases like "safe on Old Ridge," "circle twice," and "he never drives same way twice." Handwriting comparison was inconclusive. The book was too charred. As October deepened, Mountain View PD coordinated with the state police and, quietly, with the FBI's behavioral unit. The consensus: the killer used legitimate or plausible pretenses, work, money, rides, to lure and isolate vulnerable young women, then moved them quickly onto secondary mountain trails he knew intimately. He was practical, almost invisible, a local predator who could blend in, then vanish without a trace. Detectives worked through sleepless nights, fueled by desperation and caffeine. They divided suspect lists into 3 tiers: locals with military backgrounds, recent drifters, and anyone with a record for violence or sexual assault against women. Yet, again and again, suspects slipped through. One man, a discharged Army cook living out of his van, checked every box, right until his alibi for 3 of the murders held firm. The most promising DNA lead, taken from cigarette butts at the Blue Tarp campsite, matched nobody in local or national databases. The unrelenting pattern of false hope battered the force. At squad meetings, tempers flared, blame bounced like lightning, and scars deepened. A few quietly started to wonder, was the valley cursed? Was this the work of one man? Or did something worse prowl in the wilderness, picking up where another had left off? What united each new file added to the swelling Bear Valley casebook was a sense of something off, something methodical, yet capricious. The killer left just enough behind to lure authorities onward, but never enough to convict or even properly accuse. No 2 witness stories matched up exactly. Every security video was fuzzy or accidentally erased. The killer's signature, a military belt, discarded photo, torn-up purse, always felt planted, utterly cold in its calculation. By Halloween, the Bear Valley investigation was less a police case than a rolling fever dream. Locals locked their doors at sundown. Teenage girls stopped wandering out alone. And in Mountain View, everyone wondered which grotesque clue would drop next, or whether the II's nightmare might finally be closing in on the hunter himself. Horrific memories and the death of a best friend, not every tragedy leaves behind only corpses. Sometimes it carves a pit of grief so deep in the living that survival feels like a curse. For Jenny Tran, Bear Valley would always be haunted ground, and memory itself a labyrinth she could barely navigate. Yet her truth, the fragments she dared to share, became a vital piece of the investigation, offering a glimpse of cruelty even investigators hadn't imagined. Jenny Tran and Tracy Wang had always stuck together since their first day at CU Boulder. The daughters of Vietnamese immigrants, they navigated American college life with a shared wariness and a private, unbreakable bond. When the two fell on hard times in the spring of 1994, they became nearly inseparable, pooling their last dollars and, in a moment of desperation, answering a vague ad for short-term, high-paying labor outside Mountain View. Jenny would replay those decisions endlessly, convinced fate had been stalking them, not just chance. The ad's contact, a man in his 40s, wiry with angular features, short hair hidden beneath a ball cap, met them at a greasy spoon off Route 28. He talked quickly and shrugged off their nervous questions. "It's just brush clearing, picking up trash on the hiking trails. Easy stuff, pays cash the same day." His voice had an odd, gravelly twang, one Jenny could never quite place. But poverty, again, stilled her doubts. The day they left for Bear Valley, sunrise glinted copper off the battered truck's chrome. The man, who called himself Mr. Lee, joked to break the silence, pointed out distant mountains, tried winning small talk, yet something about his eyes, always watching the rearview mirror, set Jenny on edge. She exchanged nervous glances with Tracy, but forced a smile. Instead of heading toward a trailhead or obvious work site, the truck turned off down a rutted back road. Pines pressed dark and close on either side as the vehicle crawled along what barely passed for a path. Cell phones didn't work. The radio played static and distant gospel from Wyoming. Jenny whispered doubts to Tracy, but Mr. Lee assured them, "Just a bit farther up, a quick day's work, and you'll be back in town for dinner." Jenny later remembered how the forest suddenly muted, how not a single bird called, and the hush was broken only by the truck's engine idling down. Then he stopped without warning. "You two? Tools are in the back," he barked. But when Jenny hopped out, it was only seconds before fear blossomed into nightmare. The man swung a metal pipe at Tracy before either could react. Jenny's ears rang as she whipped around in panic. Tracy was on the ground, stunned, blood starting to pool at her temple. Mr. Lee's face, hard, lips twisted in concentration, loomed over them. He bound Tracy's wrists with a military belt, cinching until she whimpered. Jenny froze, rooted by terror, as he turned to her. He shoved Jenny to the ground, her hands clawing pine needles, mind racing to remember anything. Self-defense, prayers, mother's warnings. But Tracy, even in her stunned state, screamed Jenny's name. It was that scream, the shared terror and devotion, that startled the killer enough for Jenny to scramble away, biting and clawing at his arm. She darted into scrub, dodging branches, the sound of Mr. Lee's boots pounding behind. The next minutes wavered between clarity and chaos, the crunch of brush, heavy breathing, her own heartbeat thundering. Jenny tripped, fell, scrambled again, her jeans shredding against rocks and her throat clogged with sobs. At last, blind chance took pity. She tumbled down a short embankment and landed in icy water. She pressed herself flat as heavy footfalls thrashed above. She heard him, cursing, crashing deeper in search of her. Then, an eternity later, an unnerving quiet. It was only then, shivering and raw, she realized Tracy was gone. Jenny lay hidden for hours until sure, by instinct, not logic, that her pursuer had retreated. She crawled out as the sky was almost dark, pain radiating through every limb. Scratches and bruises mapped her arms, but all she could see in her mind was Tracy's final, pleading look. Jenny staggered through the trees, following the distant glow of a road, finally collapsing near a pull-off where a passing trucker would scoop her up and deliver her to Mountain View's tiny emergency room. But the horror didn't end there. In the days that followed, Jenny's recollections were a jagged mosaic. Night terrors and flashbacks seized her. She'd wake screaming, convinced someone was standing at the end of her bed with a belt in their hands. She told police only what she dared: the shape of her abductor's jaw, the slant of his nose, the blue shirt buttoned to the wrists, but she choked on guilt for not being able to save Tracy. The community, still reeling from prior discoveries, regarded Jenny as both victim and answer. Police pressed her for every detail. Therapists offered coping techniques, but Jenny isolated herself, afraid every shadow meant Mr. Lee waiting to finish the job. She refused to be photographed, changed her phone number, spent weeks couch hopping, unable to face Tracy's family. For law enforcement, her survival was both miracle and fuel for greater urgency. Her composite sketch, drawn in stages through tears, was broadcast to agencies and news outlets from Denver to Cheyenne. The details Jenny forced herself to recall: the smell of cigarettes and oil, mismatched boots, the string of army dog tags jingling at his neck, became vital clues. Investigators scoured Bear Valley again, returning to the area Jenny haltingly marked on a map. Weeks later, search dogs and volunteers recovered Tracy's body, half buried under pine needles less than a quarter-mile from where Jenny escaped. She had been strangled, with the same type of belt, wrists bound, face turned toward the thicket, as if watching and waiting for rescue that never came. Jenny's testimony and survival recast Bear Valley's horrors with fresh urgency and emotion. The press hounded her for interviews, sometimes distorting her saga, painting her half-hero, half-haunted. The guilt and dread, Jenny later admitted, were almost as overwhelming as the original terror. The case would never leave her. Yet without her memories, the horror, the chase, the final, heart-wrenching moments of friendship, one more young woman might simply have become another lost voice, another anonymous headline. Instead, Jenny's scars and truths pressed Bear Valley closer to justice, and closer, too, to the hope that memory, terrible though it was, could spark courage and, just maybe, redemption. The persistence of the investigation team. For the men and women of the Mountain View Police Department and its partners, the Bear Valley murders became far more than another grim entry in the crime logs. They became an all-consuming crucible. In coffee-soaked squad rooms, in silent patrol cars parked under frosted pines, and in makeshift war rooms illuminated by harsh desk lamps, the investigation took on a life of its own, one that tested not just professional skill, but every ounce of will and heart among the team. Sheriff Sam Collins, the longest-serving member of the force, felt the heavy burden of every failure and setback. He lost track of the number of nights he drove up the winding lane to Bear Valley just to stare at the crime scenes, memorizing every tree's silhouette in moonlight, every echo along the creek bed where so many young women's lives had ended. Around him, his officers worked with equal fervor, aware that for the town to sleep soundly again, the nightmare had to have a face and a name. Yet the case, unlike any other in Mountain View's modest history, remained stubborn, slippery, and cruel. The investigation sprawled in every direction. Within weeks, the department had partnered with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, and the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Federal agents set up temporary field offices, and for the first time, Mountain View's police radio crackled with the clipped accents and jargon of big city law enforcement. Teams ran database cross-references on similar unsolved cases across Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska, hoping for a link through modus operandi or DNA. Tips poured in, hundreds every month, most dead ends, but all dutifully followed up, each promising the breakthrough that always seemed just out of reach. Officers performed grueling daily searches, fanning out in color-coded grids through the thick underbrush. They traced power line cuts, abandoned trails, and animal tracks, supported by volunteers and teams of cadaver dogs. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras swept the dense pine forests, searching for signs of recent disturbance, hidden camps, or unburied remains. Caravans of news trucks and curious onlookers gathered at turnoffs, but nothing ever seemed to break the story fully open. Detective Monica Ramirez became the team's beating heart. Often the first to arrive and last to leave, she came to know every detail of the case as if it were stamped on the back of her eyelids. Day after day, she reconstructed timelines, analyzed grainy ATM camera footage, and spent countless hours interviewing everyone from drifters to parents of missing girls. Monica developed her own grid of evidence: color-coded string, hand-drawn maps, and cross-referenced victim profiles papered the walls of her cramped corner office, slowly accumulating in layers like tree rings marking the passage of unrelenting weeks. In truth, the case bore down on everyone in Mountain View's law enforcement. Officer Julie Benton, once lighthearted and quick to joke, lost her smile. Rookie Deputy Anderson stopped playing softball on weekends. The crusty town dispatcher started locking up tightly at night, jumping at the ring of her own phone. But it was the community's outpouring of both panic and solidarity that hardened the resolve of the investigation team. Neighborhood watches sprang up, even in isolated rural corners. Volunteer search parties combed the valley's edges. At one point, a retired geology teacher offered his expertise on soil composition, suggesting which lowland pockets might conceal bodies. Even the local church ran a 24-hour prayer circle, leaving coffee and sandwiches nightly at the police station. Each time, a false lead threatened to sap morale. A look-alike apprehended in Boulder, or a truck fitting the killer's description found ditched in a Cheyenne alley. Sheriff Collins called a meeting. In these closed-door gatherings, he reminded the team of the faces: Jenny Tran's haunted stare, Alicia Porter's trembling hands, and the mothers who wept in his office, clutching snapshots of bright young daughters. "This isn't just evidence," he would say. "These are our daughters, our neighbors, our sisters. We owe them more." Strategy meetings sprawled past midnight with maps, grainy prints, cups of black coffee going cold, and the persistent smell of disinfectant. Coordinating with specialists from Denver, the task force ran psych profiles, debated possible motivations, and organized nighttime stakeouts. Frustration grew when expert profilers could agree only on the killer's potential local knowledge and opportunistic nature, but not on a unique trait that could tie him, irrevocably, to the crime. Public pressure forced periodic press conferences, and every public statement from the sheriff's office was pored over by the media, with wild speculation filling the air whenever anything resembling news broke. Underneath the orderly updates for the press, visible stress lined the faces of detectives. No new body, no confession, no conclusive physical evidence, just the mounting burden of what felt like endless pursuit. Yet, not a single officer suggested giving up. Outside town, undercover officers posed as hitchhikers or vulnerable job seekers near Bear Valley's trailheads, hoping the killer might try again and be caught in the act. Unmarked patrol cars lurked in the shadows at night, engines idling, radios set low. Dozens of women interviewed. Many runaways or recent arrivals spoke of feeling watched or being offered rides by strange men in battered pickups, but no two stories exactly aligned. Still, each account was logged and mapped, as methodical as a scientist assembling a fragile mosaic in a field laboratory. Despite all obstacles, burnout, and trauma, the investigative team's solidarity began to deepen. Officers took on extra shifts, trading off to let parents attend their children's games or help care for ailing grandparents. No one worked alone for long. Families of the original victims sometimes brought in meals, gestures that left detectives choked up, but determined not to fail them. Late-night email chains and impromptu pep talks in the dark outside Bear Valley unified the disparate law enforcement factions into a single, stubborn front. Months blurred together, autumn giving way to winter's snows. Even as icy wind battered the mountain roads and searchers' fingers froze on the trigger of their flashlights, the routine never faltered. In bare bulb station basements, evidence was catalogued and recatalogued, every photo and item cross-checked with FBI databases. Possible suspects were interrogated again and again, some brought in so often they came to recognize investigators by their first names. But persistence was more than dogged repetition. The best breakthroughs came as much from late-night intuition as from science. Ramirez, staring at the tangled red yarn on her map, suddenly realized that while the killer's drop sites seemed scattered, all were within sight of ancient, now unused fire roads, likely a remnant from a former forester's or hunter's knowledge of the area. Teams cross-checked construction records and old hunting permits, slowly whittling down a list of local men uniquely familiar with the valley's secrets. Through all setbacks, the knowledge that every action, every sleepless night, could bring them closer to the truth bound the team together. Law enforcement developed a rhythm of hope and heartbreak, but it was their absolute refusal to let Bear Valley's chilling legacy fade into another cold case that kept the investigation alive. The killer remained nameless, phantom-like, but the team's solidarity never wavered. As the one-year anniversary approached, Mountain View's officers stood arm in arm with grieving families and vowed, whether by luck, science, or sheer endurance, Bear Valley's secrets would not remain buried forever. Suspects, caught, released, and the relentless hunt. The investigation into the Bear Valley killings was never a simple matter of following a trail of breadcrumbs to a singular, obvious culprit. Instead, it unfolded as a maddening chess game between law enforcement and the shadows cast by suspicion. Mountain View became a cauldron of dread and paranoia, rumors swirling with every shift in the wind. Over the years, no face became more entwined with false hope and bitter disappointment than that of Paul Yu. Paul Yu entered the case not as an obvious villain, but as a faint, persistent presence hovering at the edge of the investigation. He was a Korean-American in his 40s, working odd maintenance jobs across mountain towns, and his name first cropped up in the spring of 1995. A logging foreman described a loner with a fondness for hunting knives and surplus military gear who camped alone near Bear Valley each summer. Several locals remembered a thin, athletic Asian man stopping in for supplies and paying in cash, always polite, never lingering, rarely smiling. Yu's story was both tragically ordinary and strangely opaque. He claimed to be a veteran of the Gulf War, but records proved frustratingly scant. His camper van, battered and mostly anonymous, was seen several times in proximity to locations where disappearances occurred. When police finally brought him in, it was less for a single line of incriminating evidence than a sense that his movements, restless, unrooted, always circling the mountain's perimeter, fit the erratic choreography of the killer they sought. The arrest itself unfolded in a spectacle of tension. Yu was picked up at dawn outside a gas station, the SWAT team swarming his campsite before he could even finish brushing his teeth. Inside the van, investigators found a collection of camouflage jackets, a U.S. Army canteen, twine, an old utility belt, and a hunting knife with a nicked blade, but none of it could be definitively tied to the murders. There were no bloodstains, no trophies, no diaries of confession. Still, for Deputy Ramirez, the find gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the image of Yu's steady, almost weary gaze as he sat handcuffed in the Mountain View interrogation room. For weeks, Paul Yu was the only story in town. The media painted him alternately as a tragic drifter and a cold-blooded monster. Civic pressure mounted. Angry relatives demanded answers. Terrified parents crowded town halls, and protesters circled the courthouse with placards warning, "Monsters wear many faces." Sheriff Collins, though desperate for results, insisted on caution. "We're not looking for a scapegoat," he reminded his team. "We're hunting the truth, even if it writhes out of reach." Press conferences became increasingly fraught. Journalists pressed for every scrap of evidence, but the DA's office refused to share details for fear of jeopardizing the case. During the 2 months Paul Yu languished in county lockup, the forensic net was cast as wide as technology allowed. DNA from his clothes and the van was sent to state, and federal labs compared against hair and skin cells found on the victims. His boots were meticulously analyzed for chemical composition and tread, measured against casts taken from the ravine and ridge sites in Bear Valley. Every one of his phone calls, letters, and visitors were tapped and monitored. Yet each test returned the same answer: inconclusive, inconclusive, inconclusive. At the same time, Yu's alibis for key nights seemed shaky at first blush. A few employers confirmed his presence late into the evenings, but others admitted he sometimes slipped away, without explanation. The case against him built itself on a scaffold of circumstantial oddities: a receipt for a late-night meal, an ATM withdrawal in Mountain View at 3:05 a.m., a camping permit issued less than 2 miles from where a body was later found. But faced with the burden of proof, these were splinters, not nails. Interrogations with Yu revealed little. He listened to questions with stoic composure, occasionally offering clipped, honest answers. "I sleep in my van to save money. Yes, I like to fish. No, I don't talk to people much. Sometimes I walk the ridge at night. Clears my head." When pressed harder, he neither grew hostile nor defensive, simply shrugged. "You want me to remember every path I walked? Out here, every tree looks the same." As the weeks dragged on, fissures began to show around the investigation. The composite sketch from surviving witnesses, the sharp chin, the military jacket, the unreadable eyes, could fit Yu, but also dozens of other men in the region. A neighbor at a previous campsite admitted to seeing Yu the night one girl vanished, but later recanted, admitting he'd been drinking. Importantly, none of the physical evidence, no fingerprints, no hair fibers, no matches in tire treads, ever made the leap from plausibility to certainty. The crucial moment came when the forensic lab reported Yu's DNA as a non-match for the most damning biological samples collected at Bear Valley. Finally, after nearly 70 days of scrutiny, Yu's attorney demanded his release. D.A. Stinson, grim but fair, admitted the threshold for probable cause had been eclipsed by the avalanche of ambiguity. On a cloudy morning, dense with both media cameras and silent disbelief, Paul Yu walked out of county jail. He didn't look back. The aftermath raked Mountain View raw. The town polarized along bitter lines. Had they let a killer walk, or had they just ruined an innocent life? Yu's van, repeatedly vandalized and spray-painted with threats, was abandoned at the edge of town. Residents debated, shouted, speculated. The investigation team, already battered by years of unresolved horror, found themselves caught in the undertow of public outrage and lingering suspicion. Ramirez herself sat long hours at her desk, turning over the evidence, a silent monologue looping in her mind. Did we let him go too soon? Or were we so desperate for a villain that we tried to conjure one from the fog? The release of Paul Yu didn't slow the hunt. It intensified it. Once more, every likely suspect was re-interviewed and mapped. Databases were queried with twisted new logic, asking not who matches the profile, but who have we overlooked while chasing the wrong lead. The team fanned out, canvassing remote cabins, abandoned bunkers, now wary of the inherent danger in both tunnel vision and public frenzy. Worse yet, the killer seemed to know he'd been gifted a reprieve. Weeks after Yu's release, fresh rumors began to percolate. Strange men were once again seen offering rides outside truck stops. A waitress reported a man in military boots lingering over coffee, staring too long at the community bulletin board. But once patrols swept in, all clues evaporated. No car, no witnesses, no fingerprints. Bear Valley slipped even deeper into paranoia. Neighbors eyed each other warily in grocery lines and whispered dark theories over back fences. Journalists camped outside the Mountain View precinct, feeding off scraps. Every sighting, every rumor, every echo of Yu's release. For law enforcement, the hardest part was the gnawing sense that the real predator might be laughing at them. Emboldened by the near miss, blending back into the tapestry of mountain folk and loners who called the region home. But Yu's brush with accusation didn't just haunt him. It reshaped the investigation's very DNA. The task force was forced to re-examine procedures, tighten forensic protocol, and widen the search parameters. Behavioral profilers met with local clergy, mental health clinics, and military bases, hunting connections missed during the wild weeks of Eumania. They scrutinized the possibility that perhaps the killer was a born and bred local, someone with just enough guile to mimic suspicion and slip free at the first sign of scrutiny. For months after Yu's release, the phrase, "Have we got the wrong man?" became a grim joke among detectives. It was a hard lesson in humility, reminding everyone involved that evil rarely wears a mask. Sometimes it carves a blank, unknowable face. Yet out of hardship comes resolve. Instead of collapsing under public scorn or lingering suspicion, the team used the painful lessons from Paul Yu's case to steel their determination. They realized that only patience, precision, and an utter refusal to settle for easy answers could lead them to the truth. As winter blanketed Bear Valley in snow, the task force huddled in the icy glow of their map-strewn war room, vowing that next time their net would be foolproof. The shadows might still cloak a murderer, but the investigators' vigilance had only sharpened, and Bear Valley, with all its hidden horrors, would never catch them unprepared again. New deaths and the abyss of despair, with the grim shockwaves of the Bear Valley murders still echoing through Mountain View. The hope that such savagery would fade into the past proved agonizingly naive. As autumn melted into a desolate winter, a chilling new pattern emerged on the outskirts of town, one that would push the investigative team and the broken-hearted community to the precipice of exhaustion and despair. The grim discoveries began quietly. First, a missing persons flyer tacked to the window of a shuttered bakery, then another, and another. Each new disappearance chipped away at whatever remained of the town's fragile sense of safety. The victims fit a hauntingly familiar profile: young women, mostly transient or isolated, struggling to stay afloat in low-wage jobs, or simply passing through. Their absence barely registered at first, often explained away as runaways or restless drifters, vanishing into the vast, indifferent wilds of rural Colorado. But within a year, 4 new bodies were found in the maze of muddy paths and ravines, not far from the old Baker chemical plant, ground that reeked of both industrial abandonment and something far more sinister. The murders bore a gruesome, near-signature pattern. Each victim had been strangled with what forensic specialists identified as a military issue belt. All bore the unmistakable marks of violence and degradation. The bodies were left in naked humiliation or hastily shrouded by trash bags or scattered brush, as if their killer wanted to both hide and display his acts at once. Despite months of relentless surveillance and stakeouts, the Mountain View Police Department faced the heart-sinking truth. Their quarry was as elusive as a ghost. Night after night, undercover officers camped in battered cars along logging roads, disguising themselves as workers or drifted youth. Yet the killer never took the bait. Shifts blurred together in a relentless cycle of exhaustion, coffee, and cruel disappointment. The wind howled down off the ridges, frost etching the windows as investigators haunted the shadowed trails, never knowing which footstep would lead to another scene of horror. By now, people barely recognized their own town. Even the stoic old-timers, those who had survived blizzards, wildfires, and economic collapse, seemed to shrink with each news bulletin. Parents barricaded their homes, people eyed neighbors with suspicion, and every unfamiliar vehicle raised nervous glances and whispered speculation. At the Baker plant and its surrounding woods, decades-old myths were resurrected. Stories of the land's cursed past, of greed and ghostly vengeance, now fused with something far too tangible. Each new victim was followed by a desperate, methodical ritual. Search teams fanned out in precise grids, accompanied by police dogs, volunteers, and sometimes the loved ones of the missing, faces taut beneath layers of practical sorrow. The forensics team, now hardened by routine, moved with a haunted efficiency, layering evidence bags, snapping photographs, dusting every belt and scrap for trace DNA. Yet the killer left little. No fingerprints, no reliable witnesses. Even the tracks through the underbrush were often lost to storms or intentionally disguised. For every small, fleeting lead, a cigarette stub, a muddy boot print, a sighting of a lone figure at dusk, there were twice as many dead ends. The townsfolk, frustrated and frightened, formed makeshift vigilante patrols that succeeded only in sowing mistrust among neighbors. The local press, at first united in outrage, now churned rumors and conspiracy. Was it the work of a drifter, a copycat, or some sick soul living under their noses? Emotionally and professionally, the investigators teetered at the edge. Detective Monica Ramirez, so long the case's anchor, found herself staring into the abyss during long, sleepless nights, replaying failed stakeouts and deadlocked interviews. Sheriff Sam Collins aged a decade before his deputy's eyes. Victim advocates and counselors saw a spike in trauma. Survivors, families of victims, and even their own officers began folding under the suffocating pressure of relentless grief. Meanwhile, the post-mortems yielded more questions than answers. Plastic ties and military belts, some worn, some new, appeared at every scene, always tied in the same distinctive knot. Defensive wounds told stories of extraordinary struggle. In the brush near the last body, a handful of quarters was found, tossed as if in hurried tribute or mockery. Each artifact became a puzzle piece, yet the larger picture remained agonizingly obscure. Out-of-town experts, called in after much soul-searching, concurred grimly. The perpetrator was deliberate, mobile, and endlessly patient. A hunter whose knowledge of the land and the habits of his prey surpassed even the police's. Despair settled over the investigation with the weight of winter snow. The community's early hope, the certainty that surely a nightmare so grotesque must end soon, gave way to numbness and defeat. Candlelight vigils flickered and died out, replaced with battered memorials by the roadside and hand-painted signs offering rewards that nobody expected to be claimed. Fear, once a sharp presence on the edge of town, became a constant companion. Mothers drove children to school, teens slipped out only in groups, and curfews that should have faded with childhood now returned by necessity. Even the landscape changed under the shadow. Where Bear Valley once beckoned with adventure and solace, it now seemed choked by secrets and the bitter ache of violence. Each new headline reminded residents that safety was a memory as fragile as the last autumn leaves clinging to frozen branches. Within the precinct, cracks had begun to show in the foundation. Conflicts simmered between outside agencies and local officers, dozens of missed opportunities, overlapping lines of command, personality clashes, and the corrosive drip of doubt that began to poison faith in one another. But for all their infighting and exhaustion, not a single person on the task force, seriously, spoke of giving up. To do so would be to let the killer claim victory over not just the dead, but the living as well. And so, in the heart of that bleak winter, something both terrible and courageous happened within the soul of Mountain View. A collective grim determination settled in. The hunt, it seemed, would not break them. Even as the list of victims grew and the shadow of Bear Valley spread wider over the region, the surviving officers and the families who haunted the precinct's halls vowed to outlast the terror, no matter the cost. As investigators reviewed every report by dim lamplight, scouring service records and logging warrants for every known predator, a realization hardened within them. The abyss was not simply the evil of a killer loose among them, but the despair that threatened to consume the spirit of the town. What hope remained now lay not in a miracle, but in the relentless, methodical pursuit of justice, step by painful step, through the valley's darkness, until finally, the nightmare would end. The fortress collapses, a shocking confession, unleashed by a robbery. As the long, bitter shadow of Bear Valley's past stretched into the autumn of 1996, the mood in Mountain View hung somewhere between resignation and raw exhaustion. The bodies had stopped surfacing, but the fear remained, a cold, persistent thing that clung to window panes and creaked between floorboards every night. Despite the task force's relentless work, answers stayed out of reach. No one expected the first true break in the nightmare would come not from careful police work, but from a spur-of-the-moment crime on the slope of the valley itself, a crime that, at first, seemed entirely disconnected from the horrors of the preceding years. It was early November, and the mountain air tasted of frost. Maria Alvarez, a local herbalist known for gathering wild plants near the summit, set out before dawn with her canvas bag and time-worn boots. Maria had made this trip dozens of times, rain or shine. By late morning, she was crouched among the brush, focused on the root of an elusive wildflower, when a rustle in the trees pricked her instincts. Before she could react, a stranger was upon her, a man with hollow cheeks, greasy hair, and clothes that looked military issue, but decades out of style. The attack was quick and desperate. Maria felt rough hands snatching her canvas bag, the chill steel of a blade pressed briefly to her ribs. The stranger demanded her wallet, her jewelry, anything of value. But in his chaos, he missed the little folding phone hidden in her sock. Maria, terrified but quick-thinking, waited until he fled through the undergrowth, then stumbled down the trail, clutching her side and dialing 911 with shaking hands. The deputies responded faster than anyone thought possible. Within the hour, patrol cars boxed in the neighboring access roads, and within 3 hours, a scruffy man was caught on the bank's security camera, clumsily attempting to withdraw cash using Maria's ID and battered debit card. The image was sharp, the timestamp precise. In less than a day, Mountain View police had him. A man in his mid-40s, thin but wiry, wearing a torn army jacket and scuffed boots, face gaunt, eyes darting like a hunted animal. He introduced himself as Victor Lee. Victor Lee wasn't a complete unknown. His name had skittered across the edge of the investigators' files for years, the kind of puzzle piece that never quite fit. He sometimes slept rough, sometimes picked up seasonal construction jobs, known more for being odd and evasive than dangerous. For a while, no one thought to take him seriously as a suspect in the murders. The evidence was always too flimsy. A vague sighting here, an odd bit of army surplus gear there, maybe a strange comment at the local bar. But with the botched robbery, Victor Lee was finally caught red-handed, unable to slip away into the brush or hide behind his usual gruff indifference. It was a stroke of fate, and perhaps fatigue, that led Detective Monica Ramirez to see beyond the surface. As Maria Alvarez sat in a narrow police interview room, telling her story with shaky conviction, Ramirez studied the mugshot from the bank footage. There, under the harsh light of the holding cell, Victor Lee's sharp features looked eerily familiar. Something in the way he carried himself, in the haunted cast to his eyes, lined up with old witness sketches from the Bear Valley files. Ramirez's gut twisted. Could the man in custody be the very specter who'd haunted Mountain View for years? She ordered his belongings catalogued, scraps of folded plastic bags, a battered pocket knife, a few worthless trinkets, and, most chillingly, a strip of worn military webbing cinched into a tight, distinctive knot. The kind of knot that had become the silent signature in the Bear Valley killings. Over the next 48 hours, Victor Lee said little. His attitude ranged from belligerent to withdrawn, refusing food and deflecting questions with shrugs or silence. But he was exhausted, both physically and psychologically. And as the hours stretched on, detectives interviewing him in shifts, unrelenting in their steady, methodical questioning, Lee's composure began to crumble. A shift occurred when Prosecutor Anna Tran, reading through his background, asked offhandedly about his childhood in Nebraska. The question seemed to cut through Lee's defenses. His eyes flickered, and for the first time, his shoulders slumped. Ramirez leaned in, voice gentle but persistent. "Victor, it's not just this morning. We need to talk about what happened up on the mountain. We need to talk about the women." The room grew cold. Victor Lee's jaw tightened. For the first time since his arrest, he didn't deny. He looked away, staring at the wall for a long, silent minute. What followed was a slow, chilling unraveling, a confession that slid from Lee's mouth, like oil from a rusted engine. It started small. Yes, he'd watched and followed women in Bear Valley before. Yes, he thought about hurting people for years. But with each gentle prod and persistent question, he surrendered more details. Hours passed. Lee broke, first quietly, then with frenetic anger, and finally, desolate acceptance. He spoke matter-of-factly about the would-be victims who lost their lives in Bear Valley, how he stalked them for days, picked them when they were most alone, and lured them with promises of money or safety. He described the attacks as if reliving an ugly compulsion he couldn't explain. "I just needed to make sure they'd never trick me. Never again." The grisly details flowed. Dates, places, what they said, how they fought, what he did after. Every murder was described in cold, technical language. He remembered each victim, sometimes recalling those that had haunted the investigators' lists but had never been identified. The confession was more than just a timeline. It was an act of grotesque reckoning. Ramirez and her team listened, recording every word, feet numb and hearts racing. Lee named 8 women whose disappearances had torn the core out of Mountain View, not just the ones buried in cold case folders, but a handful more whose names had almost slipped away. Each story was a dagger: women struggling with addiction, students seeking work, strangers who'd trusted the wrong outstretched hand on a dim back road. For each, Lee could recite enough details: clothing, jewelry, the weather, the smell of pine after a rain, to make doubt impossible. He agreed to direct the team to 2 shallow graves that had never been discovered, taunting investigators with the same cruel precision that had kept him at large for years. In the process, he carelessly admitted to at least 5 more slayings at the edges of neighboring counties, blurring the boundaries of his own monstrosity. Search teams, overcome by a rush of grim adrenaline, fanned out across Bear Valley and its neighboring forests. Guided by Lee's flat, emotionless instructions, crews unearthed remains in places where only the most seasoned locals would venture. The pain of recovery was sharpened by the knowledge that these were sites combed dozens of times by grieving families, often just a few paces from established trails, madness hidden in plain sight. With every body, DNA confirmation brought fresh pangs of both closure and horror. Families who'd waited years for answers finally received them, though the relief was jagged and stained by grief. Media from across the state, and soon the nation, descended on Mountain View, broadcasting the case as the fortress collapses, a cruelly fitting metaphor for both Lee's unraveling and the crumbling illusions of safety that had once defined Bear Valley. Confession, and a town's first breath of relief. When the officers closed the interrogation room door behind them, a surreal stillness settled over the Mountain View station. Victor Lee's confession was an event that radiated out from that cramped space, staggering into every hallway, radio channel, newsroom, and household, from Bear Valley to the farthest reaches of Colorado. It was the sort of moment the team had both hungered for and dreaded, a breakthrough that offered both grim closure and a harrowing new reckoning with loss. Lee's confession unfolded over several tense hours, sometimes stuttering out in halting fragments and at other times tumbling with the crude, unfiltered detail of a nightmare. Members of the investigative team took turns observing and questioning, notebooks scribbling, recorders humming softly. The exhaustion in Lee's voice was bone-deep, yet what he shared was as coldly methodical as the violence that had swept through Bear Valley years before. He spared no detail. Lee began with the earliest known victim, describing, almost with forensic dispassion, how he had stalked her for days, observing her routines, learning which hiking trails she favored, and waiting for the perfect storm of isolation and opportunity. Sometimes, he recounted, the choice was random. Other times, it felt as if he was irresistibly drawn to the most vulnerable, a woman fighting addiction, a student who'd missed her bus, a runaway desperate for a ride or a few quick dollars. Each encounter Lee described was chillingly matter-of-fact, as if he had compartmentalized his memories into boxes sealed tight against regret. He outlined the planning, how he used work, casual offers of help, and even postings on local bulletin boards to make contact with his victims. How his Army surplus gear, now infamous in the case, served to reassure his targets. "You look like you know what you're doing. I thought you'd keep me safe," one remembered, and to reinforce the control he craved. The military belts he'd used for binding became a signature now impossible to disengage from his name. When Lee talked about the terrain, it was with the precision of a local. He knew every game trail, half-collapsed cabin, and blind spot where the mountain itself seemed to hide crimes from the world. It was the specificity that undid even the hardest detectives. Lee could describe the sound of a river swollen after summer storms, the way autumn leaves muffled the cries of his victims, the faint glow of distant porch lights as he hauled his captives into the undergrowth. He remembered the smell of the cigarette butts abandoned at one site, the barrette one woman dropped in her struggle for survival, the way headlights swept past just minutes too late. For each murder, he connected details unknown to the public, information only the killer and the investigative team could possibly know. With each new revelation, the mood among the officers shifted from elation to a raw, wrenching grief. They finally had the answers that hundreds of people, a town's worth of families, lovers, parents, had waited for. But the answers were cruel. The full catalog of Lee's admitted crimes surpassed even the most pessimistic fears. Not just the original 3, not just the handful whose remains were discovered after, but several more, names that triggered new surges of agony in the small, battered community. For the families of missing women, whose fates had for years been a source of silent torment, Lee's words were both a wound and a suture. The physical aftermath, search parties directed to long-overgrown burial sites, forensic confirmation from Denver labs, the return of personal effects to grieving parents, was somber and almost ceremonial. Mountain View became a place of dual rituals, funerals, vigils, and public mourning set against the quiet jubilation of a community emerging from an unending fog of suspicion. For many, the simple act of lighting a candle or laying a bouquet out in Bear Valley signaled the start of collective healing. Churches and counselors opened their doors beyond normal hours. Strangers offered rides, company, or just silent camaraderie at dawn and dusk along the valley's edge. The unwavering integrity of the investigative team, even in the darkest moments, now became a source of pride for the town. Ramirez, Collins, Wallace, and the rest were no longer just officers behind a badge. They attended services and stood with families at the memorials. They accepted both thanks and anger, the raw surge of emotion from a town forced to reconsider every missed connection, every open door, every shrugged-off warning from years past. Their faces became indelibly tied to a story that had defined Mountain View's late-century identity, a story of horror Yes, but also of stubborn hope. New protocols and reforms emerged from the lessons learned, ensuring women would feel safer. Search and support services in future cases were dramatically improved. The day Victor Lee was convicted, Mountain View's downtown gathered for an unofficial vigil. There was no public speech, no need for spectacle. People just stood, circling the courthouse and police station, lighting candles and sharing coffee and stories. The air was thick with relief, a kind that no verdict or news bulletin could ever entirely encapsulate. When word filtered out about Lee's sentencing, there were tears of both closure and unshakable regret for lives lost and years shattered by doubt and terror. In the months that followed, Bear Valley itself began to heal. Hikers returned, though they never quite looked at the trails the same way. New plaques were installed at key sites, reminding all who wandered the woods to beware, but not despair. Neighbors who had once mistrusted each other in the cold glow of suspicion found ways to reconnect. Community picnics, potlucks, and joint watch groups sprang up as a means of reclaiming their mountain spirit. Yet the scars remained, both obvious and invisible. Some survivors and loved ones left Mountain View entirely, unable to stay in a place so inextricably intertwined with pain. Others remained, vowing to honor the lost by building a town defined by vigilance, compassion, and unity, rather than fear. For those most deeply involved, the detectives, the volunteers, the nurses and first responders, the case would always be a ghost story stitched under their skin, part warning, part anthem of perseverance. Victor Lee's capture and confession didn't erase the past, but it allowed a battered community to take the first full breath it had drawn in years. The rain still fell in Bear Valley. The sun still rose over its scarred hills. But Mountain View, at long last, woke to an ordinary morning, its nightmare faced, named, and forever changed. The aftermath: justice delivered and a town reborn. When Victor Lee's death sentence was handed down, the air in Mountain View seemed to shift. A thin, cautious relief overcame the town's battered spirit. The verdict, covered by every major media outlet in Colorado and echoed across national headlines, was both an ending and a beginning. No one, not even those closest to the horror, expected healing to follow swiftly or easily. But the official closing of the Bear Valley case marked a tectonic turning point, allowing a long-traumatized community to finally envision life beyond dread. Justice, in practical terms, moved swiftly. The trial lasted less than 2 months, but carried the gravity of decades. Families of the victims sat together in somber solidarity, clutching photographs and fading letters, some weeping quietly, others clinging to the hope that their lost loved ones might now find peace. The prosecutor, Anna Tran, embodied the town's resolve, laying out Lee's calculated brutality, his manipulation, his years of stalking and predation, the indelible marks left on Bear Valley's wild soil. As Lee's sentence was read and court officers let him out, an almost electric silence fell in the courtroom. A silence, some later said, that sounded like the sigh of a whole valley finally exhaling. Yet true closure remained elusive. Once the court cameras were packed away and the last news vans rolled out, Mountain View was left to reckon with the scars and legacy of its ordeal. Memorial services doubled as reunions for families who had grown closer in their shared grief and endurance. The names of the dead were carved into brass plaques and mounted on the valley trailheads. Local artists created a mural for Bear Valley's main square, a cascade of wildflowers interwoven with the portraits of those lost, watched over by painted pine trees and the suggestion of sunrise on distant peaks. For many, it became a place to weep or sit quietly, but also to celebrate the lives reclaimed from fear. I remember sitting in the park, the air heavy with late spring blooms, overhearing conversations that echoed the town's resilience. Children once forbidden from wandering too far, now played near the eyes, streams, their laughter ringed by new warning signs, but also by a sense of hope. Mothers and daughters held hands a little tighter. Fathers volunteered for nighttime patrols long after the last threat had faded. The neighborhood watch groups, no longer driven by paranoia, evolved into true bands of friendship and support, proof that what tried to divide Mountain View had, in its aftermath, bound it even closer together. For the investigation team, victory was never absolute. Detective Monica Ramirez and Sheriff Collins became both heroes and permanent members of Mountain View's collective myth. They made frequent appearances at schools, prevention workshops, and charity events, where their message was part warning, part call to empathy. Never let fear own our stories again. In police headquarters, the Bear Valley files were boxed and sealed, marked as closed, but a photo of every known victim hung on a wall of remembrance, a daily motivator to stay vigilant for the vulnerable and the missing. Not all wounds healed in public view. Some survivors, unable to bear the memories, left Colorado behind. Others found healing in the routines of everyday life: gardening, teaching, reopening shops shuttered in the dark years. Counselors and clergy became household names, providing space for grief groups and survivor support circles. The annual Bear Valley Remembrance Run grew from a handful of participants to hundreds, with the mayor leading the first lap, a gesture that became tradition, inviting the entire community to outrun the dark. Every mile was dedicated to a victim, and every finish was marked with a wildflower placed on the mural downtown. There were reforms, too, born of hard lessons. Local government increased funding for battered women's shelters, expanded crisis response teams, and launched safe transit programs for those traveling alone at night. High school students developed peer education groups, teaching each other how to recognize danger signs and advocate for their friends. Police protocol changed. No missing person report was ever dismissed as a likely runaway, and every vulnerable individual was treated as someone needing help and hope. Though Victor Lee sat on death row, his name was rarely spoken. The town's energy turned from his crimes toward its own recovery. There were still nights, especially around the anniversaries, when fear crept back into bedrooms and dreams. But the violence that once allowed suspicion to poison Mountain View's streets was, at last, outmatched by acts of kindness, remembrance, and solidarity. The scars of Bear Valley would fade, never vanish, but Mountain View emerged remade, stronger, more compassionate, and fiercely protective of every vulnerable soul within its reach. I often reflect on the final change as subtle, but profound. It isn't that grief disappeared, it's that the community found ways to carry it together. Candles burned in windows, wildflowers grew where bodies once lay, and music, once silenced by sirens, returned to the mountain air. And if you asked anyone, old-timers and newcomers alike, what justice truly meant, they'd point not just to a conviction, but to each day that Bear Valley's wild beauty was reclaimed for laughter, memory, and hope. That is how justice lived on, how a haunted town became a beacon once more.